You guys ready to rock?
Best NYC computer. Try it again.
Good morning, New York!
That's better.
Are you ready to rock? Yeah. You wanted the best, but they got stuck in the tunnel, so you got me. So, my name is Brian Contos. I am the Chief Strategy Officer with Sevco Security. A little bit about me. I've been in cyber for about 25 years. I started with DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency, and then after that, Bell Labs, and then just started building a bunch of startups with friends. So I've had 2 IPOs. I've had 8 acquisitions. We were just sold my last company to Google about a year ago. It's been a fun ride. I wrote a book, a couple books, but I wrote my last book with the director of the NSA. My mom said it was good. I think she's the only one who read it. So just food for thought, if you ever write a book with somebody that's been with the NSA for 35 years, note they're very verbose, and the book can stop a low-caliber bullet. I did a documentary with General Michael Hayden, former head of the CIA, and the NSA, and literally dozens of people saw that as well. So I haven't been that successful on that side of the house, but I do enjoy building companies. As my wife likes to tell me, she measures it based on weight. So I've gained about 5 pounds per IPO or acquisition, but I did the math, joke's on her, it's closer to 6.5 pounds per IPO and acquisition. So today's presentation is xIoT hacking demos and strategies to disappoint bad actors. So xIoT is one of those made-up terms. Well, I guess every term is a made-up term, when I think about it. Like Ohio, that's made up. The brain named itself, so that's kind of made up. So anyways, it stands for Extended Internet of Things. And we'll dive into what that means. So what exactly is xIoT? So it's really 3 categories. The first one is what we generally think about when we think about enterprise IoT. These are security cameras, digital door locks, UPS systems, printers, products like that. And by the way, out of all of the products, printers are by far, 100%, the most promiscuous of all IoT devices. In fact, I think there was a Nelly Furtado song about printers a few years ago. And what I mean by that is you can connect through wired, wireless, Bluetooth low energy, HTTP, HTTPS, SSH, Telnet, FTP, TFTP. They're like, use me, print me, use my ink. So by far, we see these promiscuous printers being attacked almost more than any other device. The number 1 device by far is security cameras, but printers, just because the volume and variety are really high. So that's enterprise IoT. The next category, the second of the 3, this is OT. These are things some people just call SCADA devices or industrial control systems. It's digital equipment that controls physics, voltage, volume, speed, different mixtures if you're talking about like batch manufacturing versus discrete manufacturing. These are the devices that you see in power and energy, oil and gas, transportation, building cars, etc. So these are those OT devices. The final category, which we're all familiar with, but a lot of people tend to skip over this when they think of xIoT, these are the network devices. These are the switches, the NAS, the load balancers, the wireless access points. Now, what all these groups have in common, besides just being in my presentation, is they're purpose-built firmware and hardware. So you typically don't use a camera for printing, and you typically don't use a digital door lock to be your UPS system. So they're purpose-built. Even though they're purpose-built, they're generally running popular operating systems, typically Ubuntu. We see BusyBox. On the network side, a little bit of BSD, and on the OT side, you see real-time operating systems like VxWorks. By and large, though, usually Linux, or Linux-like, like Android, for example. They're network connected almost always. Some of the real old school OT stuff that they depreciate it like they do turbines when they're at a dam, that stuff's been around for decades. So some of those things aren't network connected, some of them are. Some of them are actually running like Windows NT 3.51 or the real new stuff, NT 4.0, which has been end of life for about 20 years. And they can't run, for the purposes of this presentation, kind of why we put this together, security. So you can't load, Cylance, you can't load CrowdStrike, you can't put McAfee, you can't put an endpoint anti-malware firewall or IPS on these systems. You just can't load it. They don't operate that way. There are some companies that are trying to look at microcode that you can put on there, these micro agents. That has to be done at the manufacturer. It hasn't really caught on. So technically, these are non-security capable devices. There's things you can do to make them more secure, but you can't install the things that we think about generally in IT on these devices. Now, while this presentation is about xIoT and hacking xIoT, and it's really interesting, don't lose the forest through the trees. Remember, xIoT is just another asset within your environment. Just like you have laptops, cloud, SaaS solutions, applications, users. And you probably have some type of asset intelligence program. Hopefully none of you are using spreadsheets still, although I know some of you are, to track all your critical assets within your organization. So you shouldn't have a separate xIoT security group. You might have people that specialize in that, but it should be part of your overall security group. And it shouldn't be a separate solution that's standalone in a silo, like we see here. I know it's a bit hard to read, but you see products like Phosphorus or Axonius, Nozomi. These are products that specialize in this xIoT world in terms of discovery and actually remediating certain risks. But that has to be all incorporated to your larger asset intelligence program. So again, don't lose sight of that through this presentation. It's really easy to get kind of in the silo, which is just xIoT, but not a part of your grander strategy. And when you're talking about those assumptions, a lot of people look at asset intelligence from sort of a assumption-based perspective, juxtaposed to an evidence-based perspective. Make sure that you're going beyond the way that we used to do asset intelligence, back in the olden days, which is like 5 or 6 years ago. Make sure you're actually looking at across the board. Tell me every device I have that's running Malwarebytes and CrowdStrike, and it's in Microsoft Active Directory, and these users have access to it. And be able to correlate that asset information, just like you're able to do on a SIM side, for example, looking at event data. That's kind of the new. That's what people are doing with assets today, and certainly xIoT has to be part of that if you're going to be successful. So that's all I have to say about assets. Now, when we think about xIoT, the volume, velocity, and variety is staggering. If I asked all of you to just name 5 xIoT devices, you'd probably have very, very different perspectives on what they are, brands, use cases, etc. But consider this. There's about 10 million servers in the cloud. I'm not talking about virtual machines or anything like that. I'm just talking about physical devices. And think about that as kind of the number of horses in the world. There's about 60 million, so it's pretty small. If we think about how many traditional computers with actual keyboards connected to them, like my laptop here, that number has been decreasing year over year over year. Today, there's about 5 billion of those, or roughly the number of people, which is about 8 billion. So that number continues to decrease. So let's look at the number of xIoT devices. There's about 50 billion, or roughly the number of birds in the world, and growing rapidly, and being developed by virtually every country out there, most of which have organizations developing them that are not technology companies, certainly not security companies, and certainly not in a very security-minded way. So there's a ton of these, which means it's a very target-rich environment for attackers. So who here has used Kibana? Okay. Who here has used Shodan? Okay, so a lot of you guys use Shodan. The reason I asked about that is we're going to do a little Kibana a little bit later. So Shodan, for those of you who aren't familiar, just to kind of dumb it down, it's like a Google search to show me what's connected to the internet at any given time. Now, it's not perfect, and it's not awful, but it's pretty good. And it can give us some kind of rough estimates of numbers. So the first one I said, tell me how many security cameras are actually connected to the internet right now. And it's over 4 million. And then I looked at printers, and I looked at some other things. This last category are UPS systems, uninterrupted power supplies. What's the use case of having your UPS, which you probably have because you probably have something really critical plugged into it, out on the internet and exposed like that? It probably isn't very good. And I'll probably say that there's some percentage of these devices that are honeypots, and they're just looking to get attacked. But even if it's 5%, still, why would you have a UPS? Now, here's a question for you guys. What do you think is the most popular brand of UPS around the world? APC, great. Furthermore, what do you think the default username and password is on APC UPS? APC. And if you didn't know, I used this other hacking tool called Google. And I said, what's the default password for APC UPS? And in less than a half a second, it said, oh, it's lowercase APC and then lowercase APC. So we have a bit of a competition in our company. If we ever find an APC UPS that doesn't have the default password APC, everybody in the company gets a steak dinner. We've been eating a hell of a lot of chicken because it's never happened 100% of the time. So those roughly 13,000 that are out there right now, you can log into them with APC, disable them, or leapfrog into the organization. Not that you should, but you could, and there you go, and now you know. A few more stats that are kind of interesting when it relates to these xIoT devices. So there's about 3 to 5 xIoT devices per employee. So a company of 10,000 people has roughly 30 to 50,000 xIoT devices, which is about twice as many than they generally think they have when you go in. If you say, how many do you guys think you have? Oh, Brian, we think we've got about 25,000. In the back of my mind, I'm saying, okay, so they've got about 50,000. And that's usually about right, that 3 to 5. Now, there's a bit of a bell curve to that. A law firm is going to be a little bit less. They're closer to about 1 to 2. Retail is a little bit higher. That's closer to about 5 to 6. And then manufacturing can be even higher than that, closer to 7 or 8. But it averages out, especially financial services, healthcare, so on and so forth, about 3 to 5 per employee, right? Which is a heck of a lot more than anybody generally thinks about. And they go, oh, well, the voice over IP phones. Oh, and that's right, we have 10,000 security cameras. Oh, yep, you're right, the digital door locks and all these other things. So there's a lot. Again, a very target-rich environment. So what's the big problem? There's a lot of them. The other issue is 50% of them run default passwords, just like that APC UPS we saw. The other 25, so you've got 50,000 in your network, 25,000 of them have a default password that I can simply Google and find out how to get in. No one's changing them. Think of security cameras. A crew shows up in a van with a box of cameras, and they're drilling them into the wall, they're connecting it to power and fiber optic cable, and then they leave. Do you think they're really thinking about your security development life cycle? Do you think they're really thinking about, hey, we should go ahead and rotate these passwords every 90 days, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, at least 20 characters long, so on and so forth. We should follow good password policy. No, they're thinking, I want to bolt this into the wall so I can get out of here. That's what they're thinking. So 50% have default passwords, which means when we're saying hacking xIoT, we really have to put it in quotes, because a lot of the times you don't really have to do much more than a Google search. Now, most hacks aren't because these devices are internet accessible. We'll talk more about that later. Most hacks actually don't get in that way. But the fact that we just showed you with Showdown, there's a heck of a lot that are, it just kind of makes life a little bit easier. So 50% default passwords. The next issue is end-of-life firmware. About a quarter are running end-of-life firmware. There's no support, there's no patches coming, there's no updates, but they've been there and they're running. The other 3/4, well, those guys, the average age is 6 years. The average age of the firmware on an xIoT device is 6 years. We've all got a smartphone in our pocket, or we're holding it up and taking pictures of my slides. Regardless, would that phone work if the OS was 6 years old or the apps were? No. Or if they would, they'd be horribly degraded, right? But we're expecting these devices that are running critical enterprises to operate this way, so it's a very sad state. And what comes with old end-of-life firmware? Vulnerabilities. So if you look at these stats, 70% roughly have level 8, 9, and 10 CVSS scores. So CVEs have an 8, 9, or 10. So some of you are probably very familiar with these ratings. Those of you who aren't, a level 8, 9, and 10 means with little to no skill, closer to no skill on the 9 and 10 side. I can get remote access to your device and completely take it over. Okay? So that's the state of the state. There's a lot of them. They're very vulnerable, and the bad guys have taken notice. So there's a few common attack types out there. The first one is legacy attacks. And this is the ones that people, when they think about xIoT attacks, these are the ones that flash into their minds first. Who's heard of Mirai? Great, quite a few of you actually. Okay, so Mirai is the grandfather of IoT attacks, right? It was specifically set up to go after security cameras. And what it would do is it would get into the security camera, it would load some malware, and then people are able to turn that camera into a bot and do black hat search engine optimization, malware distribution, phishing, DDoS, all the things that bots do. Well, what they found, these attackers that were using Mirai, was, hey, there's a lot of shared libraries, and there's a lot of sort of shared code and binaries, and white labeling that's done in xIoT. So it's not just this camera that has this really bad code in this default password and is running telnet. It's actually this printer and this phone and this door lock and all these other devices that they're using the same code because the people that created it weren't security engineers. It's not a technology company, and they just plugged all this stuff together. So the white labeling and the shared libraries really impacts xIoT. So when Mirai came out, it went from cameras to very quickly a much larger network. At its peak, Mirai had more processing and network capability than Amazon and Google combined of xIoT devices. What the hell? That's huge, right? So the sad thing is, and there's many sad things in this presentation, the sad thing is we go into organizations today that still have devices that are vulnerable to Mirai. Why? Because their code hasn't been updated. It's still 6 years old, like we were talking about. Furthermore, we find organizations that are infected with Mirai. They've been running Mirai for the last several years, and they don't know or don't care or no one's watching. Remember the end of Spider-Man, the Spider-Verse, where all Spider-Men were pointing at each other, who's Spider-Man? And you go into these companies and you say, well, who's responsible for your security cameras? Well, it's the security team. Oh, no, it's not us. It's the network ops team. Oh, no, it's facilities. Facilities, what? No, we outsource that to a third party. A lot of finger pointing. Nobody wants to take responsibility. And I don't blame them. If you have 25,000 cameras that you need to update and fix the firmware, and the way you're supposed to do it is walk around with a thumb drive and a paper clip to reset this thing, it's going to take a long time, right? So nobody does it. If the choice is that or do nothing, you choose do nothing. Who's heard of an attack called RSOX? This is kind of recent. So RSOX was part of a takedown. The United States, the UK, a couple other countries. It wasn't the Five Eyes, but it was a couple other countries were involved in this. South Korea as well. There was a major botnet. This was from a Russian cybercrime group. Cybercrime by day, nation-state actors by night. We see that all the time because they have safe harbor. Just like the pirates did of the Caribbean, not Johnny Depp, but the real pirates. Anyways, I digress. So they're hacking in, and they're getting into these devices, but when they wrote the code, they say, you know what we're going to go after? Let's go after industrial control systems. We'll go after enterprise IoT. We'll even go after some network devices, but let's really focus on SCADA. And they did, because nobody really pays attention. If people don't pay attention to cameras, you know no one's really paying attention to PLCs and industrial control systems on assembly lines. Right? So they actually compromised tons of industrial control systems, probably the most widespread industrial control system attack ever. But it wasn't used to blow things up or shut the power down or destroy the chemicals in a pharmaceutical company or for an agricultural company or anything like that. It was just simply because they had the audacity to be accessible off the internet, and they added them to their botnet army. Now, these guys, for RSOX, they were actually renting their botnet out. So for $30 a day, you too could have access to this massive botnet, black hat search engine optimization, DDoS attacks, so on and so forth. But for $100 a day, you got full 24/7 online technical support to help you out. So they monetized the crap out of this thing. Cybercriminals have gotten really, really good at monetizing xIoT attacks. Nation states use them for different reasons, but cybercriminals are, look, you have more xIoT devices than you do laptops. It's super easy to get in. I can do the same type of capabilities, and I can rent these things out. And it's easy to hide, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later. Outside of these types of attacks, the legacy ones, are the physical attacks. I want to get in and shut down your power. I want to get in and spy on you with your camera. We see a lot of this in manufacturing. We see a lot of this in the video cameras that are in conference rooms. We're actually with a very, very large financial services company that had the cameras in their TVs that they had, their LCD TVs mounted in the wall in all of their executive briefing rooms compromised. And people were able to spy on them with audio and video, in some cases for a couple years. Very sad. Again, a lot of sad stories. We saw an organization where they had their digital door locks compromised, and people could unlock and lock doors at will, right? I think it was 8,500 different doors. And again, hacking wasn't really a big thing. But I mentioned nation states and cyber criminals have taken note of this. We talked about cyber criminals for RSOX. This is Frontin. Has anybody here heard of or used Frontin? So Frontin was a tool designed by contractors for the Russian FSB, specifically to find xIoT devices, compromise those devices, control those devices, and then use those devices to leapfrog to attack IT assets and cloud-based assets within that organization, which we'll get to in a moment, but that is the most prevalent type of attack today. So if you speak Russian, or you can use Google English to Russian translator, you too can have a military-grade, nation-state designed xIoT hacking tool. Why? Because after they built this tool, the Digital Revolution Hacking Group actually stole it from the Russians and released it. So you can download it on any of your favorite locations where you guys, which would never, I'm sure, download illegal stuff, but the same place where you can get movies and other tools and things like that, you can also download front-end. And it's a very powerful tool. It's very well made, actually. The next type of attack are OEM attacks. This one's really, really interesting. So there's a number of security camera companies out there that ship not with malware on their devices, but with mal-design. They're designed to be evil from the get-go. It's not like they can be patched. They were built that way from the manufacturer. So for example, I might have a security camera. I say, hey, stop recording. Don't record audio, don't record video. It says, okay, okay. I'm going to turn the green light to red. But don't tell anybody I'm still recording. And it still records. And furthermore, it doesn't only record, but it sends that information off to a distant country that rhymes with Lima. So you have this issue now where you have security cameras that measure in the hundreds of millions worldwide, recording audio and video, collecting data, sending it to some location where apparently they're doing some type of correlation, anomaly detection, temporal analysis, volumetric analysis, who knows, to try to crunch it, because it's a huge amount of data looking for people to blackmail, I guess, or looking for corporate secrets, what have you. So a couple years ago, the US government said, hey, you know what? This is bad. I said, okay, that's good. I'm glad you noticed. And we're not going to allow any government contractors or any government organizations to actually operate these cameras from Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, and so forth. But it wasn't until November of 2022 where they actually made it illegal. They're now illegal to import, and they're illegal to sell within the United States. And that's pretty interesting. But I was just at a conference called xIoT in Dubai about 6 months ago. The biggest sponsor of this conference, which was huge, there was like 200,000 people. They actually had a hovercraft motorcycle, which I thought was really cool. But 200,000 people, the #1 sponsor, Huawei. So it's not like they're gone, they're still here. But you're seeing governments all over the world now scrambling to try to get in front of these things because they're cameras specifically designed to record audio, record video, and siphon it out. Now the last group are pivot attacks, and this is the big one, so I want to keep this one to the end. These are attackers that gain access through some other means, like a phishing attack, for example, and they're like, well, great, I got you to click on something on your laptop, but I don't want to scan your laptop. Your laptop is not a great place to hide, because you've got network security and app security and data security and people looking at it and audit logs and all these other things. Why don't I just go on one of those promiscuous printers you've been telling me about, or one of those naughty Huawei cameras, and I'll just go ahead and hide out there, and then from there, I'll use that to attack your IT devices. I'll use that to siphon out sensitive data. I'll use that to attack the cloud. And Mandiant actually discovered an attack a few months back called QUIETEXIT. And this is the new. This is the one that's really making people nervous, as well it should. Because it's not about attacking your device to turn it into a botnet. It didn't come shipped malicious from the manufacturer. It's not about shutting your power off or opening up a door. Those, of course, are horrible types of attacks that can cause physical safety issues, etc. This is all about stealing your data. And they got in through a typical phishing attack, whether it was through messaging or email, social media, what have you. Somebody clicked on something, and they got their device infected. Now, to maintain persistence and evade detection, they had to pivot from there to an xIoT device. Now, do you think they just pivoted to like one promiscuous printer and one camera? Hell no. They went from there to tens of thousands of devices. Why hide in one when you can easily hide on 10,000? Makes you much, much harder to get out. Now, when they were on those devices, what they did was they installed a bit of malware. They installed Dropbear SSH. Dropbear SSH has been a tool that's been used for reverse SSH tunnels for a very long time. What was interesting about this is it was being installed on a lot of network devices, NAS, wireless access points, which is BSD, and a lot of voice over IP phones, cameras, and things like that, which is mostly BusyBox and Android, Linux, right? So they installed that. From that point on, they were able to remotely control those xIoT devices from whatever location they were at. And they used it in this particular case. This is what these APTs were up to. They used it to log on to Office 365 in the cloud. They actually set up APIs into it and local exchange services. And they were pulling emails, and they specifically target the emails from executives, anybody that had to do with M&A and BD, things like that. A lot of this was probably tied to making investments and short sells and things of this nature. That's what they were going after. They got in through phishing, pivoted to xIoT to maintain persistence, evade detection, then attacked IT, then attacked cloud, and stole sensitive data. In almost every case, the minimum amount of time that these guys were within the network before the initial discovery, we're not even talking about getting rid of it, was 2 years. For 2 years, they were siphoning off sensitive data in this way, because no one's watching these devices. Nobody's thinking about them. And like Spider-Man, everyone's hoping somebody else is doing it, right? So let's look at how you actually hack a security camera. So we've got Kali Linux here, and I think I did this in 4.3, hoping this would be easier to see, but I actually have some pop-ups that will bring up the text, so hopefully this will be a little bit easier. So we're going to hack a security camera, soup to nuts, and just show you how easy. First, I'm just going to log on to the security camera just to show you what you can do. Most of you are probably familiar, but most security cameras have a web server, and you can log into this web server. Nothing's hacking now. This is just logging in. And there's a couple things you can do. One thing, you can look at the live view, and you can see what's the security camera looking at. And in my case, I have my security camera looking at a very secure Netgear device and a Hikvision camera. Okay? So it's just staying there on the desk. So nothing really too interesting at this point. But the next thing we're going to do is look at the configuration information, because you can do that as well. IP addresses, default gateways, DNS, so on and so forth. General network config. Okay. Nothing there. We just know that we have a camera. So now I'm actually going to go back to our friend Shodan, right? And I'm going to do a quick little search here. I'm going to use the command line for Shodan instead of the cool GUI and say, show me how many of these devices actually exist in the world that are internet accessible. Oh, there's about 3.5 million of these. Okay, great. Show me how many of these just exist in the United States. Came up, oh, there's about 500,000 of these. So there's about 500,000 of these cameras that are internet accessible. And like I mentioned, internet accessibility isn't really how most organizations get in. So now, knowing that this is a Hikvision camera, which I can find out from just doing a cursory scan, I'm going to go to exploit database. Now, there's lots and lots of these. There's some that you can pay for. A hack like this is usually about $5,000, but I'm very cheap, so I just want to get the free one from exploitDB. There's some that you can get on Tor as well, and you can have stuff built for you, but we don't need to go Tor here. We'll just go regular. So I'm going to create, and this right now is just in Kali Linux. I'm going to go ahead and create a file here, and I grab that Python script from exploitDB, and I'm going to execute it. I'm just going to execute, and now it's verifying that, yes, in fact, this camera can be hacked. That's all it did. So I downloaded the script, I ran the Python, I typed in the IP address, and I said go. So now I'm going to make a directory on this device. Now I'm in the camera. I've actually exploited it because I ran the Python script. That's all it took. Now I'm doing some things I would do on any Linux. This happens to be running BusyBox. So we made a directory, and we called this directory bad. And the next thing I want to do once I do that is I'm going to download some tools. So I can actually download tools to my camera. I can download scanners, I can download password crackers, I can download malware, I can download whatever I want. So I'm going to use TFTP to do a remote get of a file called doBad from my TFTP server, which just happens to be running on my Kali Linux. So we download this file. Again, these are just general Linux commands, nothing special here, Unix commands. Now I'm going to change that file, 777. Anybody can read, write, and execute this file called doBad. And what's this hacking tool that we downloaded onto our security camera? It was a Shrek video. So why not? So I easily compromised the camera. The hardest part was actually taking the time to go to exploit.db and find the Python script, and then just running the Python script. So I went ahead and I uploaded that. So now I actually want to do something else. I showed that I can upload files. I want to exfil files. So I can go ahead and attack another device, grab sensitive data. For the sake of time, I'm just grabbing the PEM files, so the cert files from these devices. And I'm using SCP, which goes over port 22, just like SSH. So I'm basically doing a secure copy protocol of any sensitive data that I have on that camera. And that's how easy this is. There's the command. Again, it's just SCP. It's nothing super crazy. So I can download files to this camera. I can exfil files from this camera, and I can take those those files that I pulled off, and now I just have them directly on my database, or I'm sorry, my laptop that I downloaded them to. That simple. Again, that's hacking a security camera. All I knew about it going in was it was a Hikvision camera. I went to exploit database. I grabbed there's only a few different scripts out there. I could have run this through Metasploit, but I just decided to use the Python script by itself. I checked to see if it was vulnerable. Yes, it was. And I knew going in 90% of the time it will be. And then I just ran the execute. And once I execute that, I have full administrative privileges on that device, lower than the application that's actually running the camera. So a very powerful capability there. Now, that's enterprise IoT. Let's talk a little bit about the SCADA stuff. This is pretty interesting. I tell a lot of people that OT security and xIoT security and all this is kind of like security was in the 1990s. It's very, very early. Siemens experienced an attack called S7 Plus crash. They named it that. I don't know why. A very simple attack. You have to simply send TCP packets on port 102 to the PLC, which stands for Programmable Logic Controller. And PLCs generally do things that are based on what's called a set point. For example, I'm allowed to get up to 100 degrees or drop down to 90 degrees. And as long as I'm in that range, everything's good. But if I get hotter than that, I'm going to send an alert to a SCADA system, which is just a management control system for this, and say, hey, I'm getting too hot. Or if I get lower, I'll send an alert I'm getting too cold. So if 100 degrees is the hottest that this is supposed to get, I could go ahead and crank this up to 150 degrees and then start sending it packets on port 102. And in doing so, it's trying to send an alert, but it can't because it doesn't understand what's happening on this port 102 and it gets confused. So it just does nothing. It's essentially a DOS attack on this device. Now, Siemens said, okay, well, we have some ways you can fix this. The first thing you guys need to do is enable passwords. So, okay. So enable a password on the PLC. And then after you do that, hold on to your hats. You need to set a password. Okay. So I'm going to turn on passwords and then put a password in. Then it said, you should also update your firmware, because we know a lot of you guys are running really, really old firmware. So just do a patch update. Okay, thank you, Siemens. And what's the last piece? Turn off stuff that you don't know. Because while our PLCs aren't super naughty like a printer, they're still pretty darn promiscuous. They're running a whole bunch of open ports, FTP, Telnet, things like that you probably don't need. They might be running Wi-Fi, they might be running Bluetooth Low Energy. Shut that stuff down now. Now, this wasn't bad from Siemens. This is good information, but this was like Security 101 in 1995, right? But these are the types of things that we see time and time again. So I'm going to show you another attack. I think this one will be a little bit easier to see, because it's actually with a real physical robot. It's the neatest way to look at this. But this is an attack against an industrial robot. This robot is about 300 pounds, and it connects to a power supply that's about 200 pounds. So it's not very mobile, but it is pretty cool. And we're going to do a live attack on this. Now, a couple things about these robots. These robots are used both in batch and discrete manufacturing. So they can be used for making Volvos, or they can be used for making pharmaceutical medicine. They're really good at cutting and grinding and welding and poking and all sorts of cool things. We use it for much less technical things than that. You could also make it do push-ups, which is kind of neat, we found out. And I don't think that's the intended use case. So we went ahead and got this robot, which any of you can buy one. They're not like super secret. We got the license for it and the latest, greatest software and loaded it on there. That was actually much harder than acquiring the robot, because it was, apparently they don't just sell this to everybody, because who is buying software for a robot? Not many people. It's a pretty finite group of folks. And we went ahead and tried to figure out a way to hack it. Well, it comes with this remote control. This is called the pendant. And like any remote control, if you ever played with a remote control cars. This is like the old school one where it's connected via a wire. So you've got this remote control, and we wrote a very small basic bit of code, a configuration, that said go ahead and touch the top of the can. That's all we're doing. We're having, because we're super creative, and we took this really expensive robot and we said let's bolt it to a crate that it was shipped in, and then let's put some blue blankets behind it and have it touch the top of the can. So this pendant is what you use to actually manage it, but it can be managed two other ways. The other way is through these two PLCs you see in the racks, a Rockwell or a Siemens, like we talked about with that Siemens attack. But the third way is really cool. We found out, oh, this is network connected. I can ping it. Well, that's pretty cool. I'm sure there's no problems there at all. So let's see what we can actually do. Well, it's running a web server. That's cool. We just did a little port scan on it. And we pull up the web server, and if that's not 1995 web UI, I don't know what is. So anyways, we pull up the web server. Again, this web server is running on the robot. It actually comes default. We didn't change any configurations. This is how it is out of the box. And we can see things like, there's the version. So this was from January 10th, 2023. We see some other information. You know, who knows what any of that means. But we can go ahead and look at some of the other configurations on this device, like active programs. Now, when we pull up active programs, we can actually see what's running. Here's the thing. Intellectual property for a manufacturing company, both batch or discrete, it's stored on these devices. All these set points, all these configurations, whether you're making a drug or a Volvo, that's where it is. It's not on a file server. It's not on an Oracle database. So if you can steal that, that's actually real IP, really, really expensive IP sometimes. So we found out through the web server, well, I can look at all your configurations. So that's a thing. The next thing we found out is, wow, it comes with a virtual version of that physical remote control, that iPendant. So I can actually do all the things that that remote control did through this very old school web interface. And I go, oh, that's neat. Look at all these things. And sure enough, look, it even has an FTP server. Could that be right? And it's anonymous? What? Let me pull up the documentation. The documentation was nice enough to say this. Hey, you might find it says anonymous FTP. If it does say anonymous FTP, don't worry, you don't need a password. Thank you, Internet Accessible PDF. So now we're going to FTP into this guy. We just saw how ultra secure and hip the web server was. So let's FTP into this. Hit enter. Oh, now I'm in. Well, I'm sure I probably can't do much. It's just an FTP server. What could possibly happen? So let's pull up the directory. It's going to pull up everything that's listed. And remember, a lot of this is super secret intellectual property, right? You know, I want to steal the code that touches the top of the can with your robot. But there's the file, can.ls. That's the actual file that we're going to try to take. But I probably can't download it. Can I run a get? Maybe I can. Oh, crap, I can. So I can actually download the can file. Okay, so all I've done now is downloaded that program that touches the top of the can. So I'm going to use this hacker tool called Notepad. So I open it up, and we're going to change one variable on one set point. Right there on z-axis, it said 205 millimeters. We're changing it to 305 millimeters. Take that, robot. So now it's just sitting on my laptop, so it's not really doing anything, so I'm going to save it. I'm going to do a save as, because it has to be saved with a .ls, so nothing fancy there. So can crush is the new name. So I've now named this to can crush, and I've got it sitting on my laptop. Big whoop. The FTP server definitely won't let me put a file on the FTP server. Why? Oh, crap, it does. I can download a file, I can modify it, and I can put it back on the robot? Oh, robot. Well, that's not good, is it? And we made some calls, and apparently it's not good at all. So we go a little bit deeper and say, well, it's on the robot, but the robot doesn't know how to use it. So there's probably some secret, secure way to make it use that file. So we come over here and we look at the programs. There's can crush. Okay. So it's there, but it's still not running it. But we see there's the one we modified with the z-axis. Right there, 305. Okay, cool. So it's on the robot, but the robot's not using it. I'm sure there's no way to make it use that file. So we go into the menu system. Again, this is the virtual pendant. This is what you could do through a PLC, like a Rockwell or Siemens, or through the remote control, or through this handy-dandy web server. And even if you don't know anything about this thing, this robot, you can find out, oh, well, that's pretty easy to understand. Let me go into the default program, change it from can to can crush, and now I'm going to click OK. Okay, did you see that? I clicked OK. That was the biggest part of the hack. I clicked OK. Okay, so now can crush is the default program. The cool thing now is people reboot these robots like every couple weeks. Their cache gets full, just like laptops, computers, etc. But that will stay persistent now. And they reboot usually in about 5-10 seconds. So you see the reboot now. Even after a reboot, it's going to always run can crush instead of can. So now the robot is doing his robot stuff. He's winding up. And again, he's just supposed to touch the top of that can. And oh no! Who would have guessed can crush would crush a can? And that is how easy it was to hack an industrial robot. We used the power of logging on with HTTP and FTP and Notepad. That's about all it took. And we made it dance as well. It's actually kind of, I mean, pretty honest, it's pretty cool to play with these things. Now that was pretty obvious, that attack. It would be less obvious if I was making a gear, for example. And that gear was supposed to be grinded to 2.55 millimeters in thickness. But I have it changed to 2.50 millimeters. And it's probably going to work, and it's probably going to pass QA. And if it's in a car or a helicopter or a machine, it's probably going to operate for a while, maybe a few months, maybe a few thousand miles. But then there's going to be too much friction, and something's eventually going to break. So if you do a very small attack like that across not one robot, but across thousands of robots, and you just saw how easy it was to do, or you modify the chemical mixture in some type of pharmaceutical, you can have a dramatic and dangerous impact on things. And it was that small. And as we saw before, I could have taken the configuration file and stolen that and used it for my own personal nefarious activities. So we looked at enterprise IoT. We looked at OT. Let's now look at network devices. And I'm not going to do this as an attack. I'll just walk it through, because this one's like watching paint dry. So this is network gear. So it could be a Netgear, Linksys, whatever. We're all pretty familiar with these. But there was an attack called VPN filter, which was a bit of malware. And the compromise, get this, was the remote managed service port was running with a default password, which you would never guess an xIoT device would have a default password, but this one did. And they logged in with the default password and loaded VPN filter, which was the malware. Now this malware could do a couple of things. One, it could capture traffic, but I guess that's kind of interesting. I mean, oh, I'm going to sniff for TFTP, I'm going to sniff for FTP and Telnet and this and that. Maybe POP, I guess, is an interesting use case, but not uber interesting. Also, when you're doing heavy sniffing like that, it's like running it in debug mode, and it actually has a performance impact, so most people might detect that. The thing that's pretty cool, though, just like we did on the robot, is it stays persistent post-reboot. Because a lot of the malware previously to this generation, once it got rebooted, it was gone. But this actually stayed persistent, so that's pretty valuable. But the really, really nefarious part was, if they just got pissed off at you, they could just wipe the firmware and destroy the router. And probably not for the people in this room, but most of the people outside of this room aren't going to take the time to figure out, okay, let me download the latest firmware and update it and fix it. They'll just throw it in the trash, go down to Best Buy or order one on Amazon and be off on their way. So that's how the network ops attacks work. So that's kind of all the bad stuff. Let's talk a little bit about how to mitigate these attacks at a high level. So a lot of people say, well, I don't even know where my stuff is. You're saying I have 3 to 5 per person. How do I even find them? Can I scan for them? Well, not really. There's great tools out there for scanning. There's Tenable and Rapid7 and Qualys, but they don't work well in xIoT. And you can't really do this in an OT environment, because they'll break your laptop in half and throw it in the ocean. Because it can knock those devices down. Oh, I see an ICMP echo request 3. I don't know what that is. That's a ping. And they go, oh, I'm going to fall over and die. Because their TCP/IP stacks were written in a vacuum, and they never were expected to be operated in this way. They're more expecting things like Ethernet, serial over Ethernet, or Modbus, or DNP3. So sometimes when you hit them with a TCP/IP packet, they die. So you can't scan. Okay, well, if I can't scan, what's my other option? Should I sniff? Well, sniffing's okay, but most of the communication for these devices is encrypted. So it's hard to ascertain what the device is by sniffing traffic. It's kind of like walking through a cocktail party where there's 100 people and each of them speaks a different language that you don't know. And as you walk through there, you have to figure out what country they're from, what their name is, and what their birthday is. Sometimes you might be able to, but probably you won't. So scanning doesn't really work. So there's a new breed of products out there. I mentioned like Nozomi, Armis, Phosphorus. These are xIoT security platforms. And they're designed to do what's called intelligent discovery. And they all work in a little bit different way, but the idea behind it is they actually log on to these devices, all these disparate devices in the way that they're designed to talk. So it's like C3PO, right? He was a diplomat. He could speak like 1 million languages, including water evaporators and binary. So these platforms can go ahead and communicate with all these disparate systems, OT and IoT, extract information. Hey, you're an HP printer, model ABC123, running firmware XYZ that we know has CVEs, da-da-da-da-da. And it can pull out all that information. Now it moves on to the next one, the next one, the next one. So that's a really good approach. But remember, think back to what we talked about initially. Don't do that in a vacuum. Make sure that's part of your asset intelligence program. So the same place where you're collecting all of your asset intel, all the information, what's Malwarebytes running on, what's CrowdStrike running on, what's an Active Directory, what SaaS tools, what users, automocks, all that, and you're correlating all that information for your assets, now pull in xIoT as well. Once you do that, now you can actually start affecting change. Because we talked before about the security cameras and the people armed with a thumb drive and a paperclip to update those cameras. No one's going to do it. Well, these tools can actually do a few things. The first one is manage credentials. So PAM tools, things like HashiCorp, Thycotic, CyberArk, they're great at IT management. But they're not great at talking to xIoT devices. They can't. But they can talk to xIoT platforms, which talk to xIoT devices. So now you can start enforcing password policies. So instead of having 50% of your devices with default passwords, you can actually rotate those passwords based on your policy every 90 days. And the xIoT platform is smart enough to say, hey, this device can only take a 4-digit numeric PIN, but this device can go 20 characters, but for some reason not the letter L. I mean, we've seen all sorts of weird things. So it pulls in this intelligence, and you can actually say, okay, this is what my password strength can be, and now we're going to rotate it every 90 days. So that's really a powerful tool. So first off, let's make sure it's got strong creds, because Siemens says, make sure you have a password capability, and then add a password. So number 2, let's upgrade the firmware. Again, most of this firmware is 6 years old, or it's end of life. It's filled with vulnerabilities. So just like with the PAM tool, these devices on these xIoT platforms, Exonius, Nozomi, Phosphorus, they can log on to these devices, update the firmware, do the patches across your 10,000 phones, across your 20,000 cameras, across your naughty promiscuous printers, and they can bring everything up to date, which is really nice. And they can even do downgrades, and there's some other features there, but I'll let you guys check out some of those tools. The next one is looking for environmental drift. The second you update all your systems, as we all know in this room, wherever you started is probably broken again. So you have to have this constant monitoring. And a lot of these platforms work by relogging into these devices on a daily basis. And they say, hey, wait a tick. You were on version 5, but now you're in version 2 of the firmware. You had this awesome password through HashiCorp, but now it's set back to the default password. You weren't running Telnet and FTP. You were only running SSH, but now you got all the clear text open back up. So you can look for drift, so you can manage by exception, which means you can scale. So if you have 50,000 devices, you know these 5 devices change. So that's really important. And then the last piece these tools are great at is isolating all the malicious, nefarious devices that are illegal, like those security cameras out of China, Huawei, HKE, Hikvision, that you know are spying on you. You know you've got in your network. Well, how do you get rid of them? They do a soft brick. What that really means is they usually change the default gateway on it, so it can't actually get out on the network. And then you can go around with a drill and bolt cutters and take them out wherever you need to take out and replace it with something that hopefully is not spying on you. So as we wrap up here, it looks like we're almost at time. This is what I would suggest to all of you that are working with organizations that you think you might have some xIoT devices. Over the next week, just make some inquiries. Like, what are we doing for these devices? Is anybody managing our printers, our cameras, our door locks, all these things? Just kind of to get a state of where you are. Sadly, most organizations don't really have any process related to this. If they do, they're saying, oh, we're just going to stick everything behind a VLAN. We know the passwords suck. We know the firmware is filled with vulnerabilities. We know how it has all these issues, but we're going to stick it behind a VLAN. Nothing against VLANs, but you should really fix your stuff and not just stick it behind a VLAN. Plus, that's a very expensive and unscalable way to approach things with 50,000 devices. It's kind of like I'm typing away, and I cut open my left hand and it's bleeding everywhere, and I should go to the doctor. But instead of going to the doctor, I take my ham sandwich out of my backpack, take the bag out, put it on my hand, and wrap it up with duct tape. Sure, I'm not getting blood on my right hand on my keyboard, but I still got a bloody hand in a sandwich bag. It's pretty stupid, right? Not saying VLANs are like that. So, the other things that I'll tell you in the next 3 months, go ahead and try one of those tools, Phosphorus, Nozomi, Armis, and see what's on your network, see what the vulnerabilities are. And then, should you want to go to that next level, start integrating those tools, if you decide to purchase them, into your greater asset intelligence programs. So you can actually manage these devices, monitor these devices, be proactive about mitigating the threats, and going on from there. If anybody wants to reach me, here's my email, brian@sevco.io. Here's my LinkedIn. I know some of you are college students. We have a pretty beefy internship program. We're based all over the place. I live in San Francisco. We've got people in Austin, people all over the country. So go ahead and hit me up on the email, and I'm more than happy to point you to our HR folks. And I think we're at time? We're at time. Thanks, everybody.